Hello everybody, and welcome to this conference. I say this conference, I'm obviously not there, which is why I'm doing this recording, and I do want to apologize at the beginning for my absence. As Ian knows, and many of you do know, I've been associated with the CLG from its inception, extremely supportive of its objectives, and I would have liked to be there to listen to the debate and discussions which I've contributed to over many, many years. However, it's at a time when, for very personal reasons, connected with the suicide of my daughter last year, I can't be there, and I do apologize. Secondly, however, I would like to pay tribute, because often people do a lot of work and it's almost taken for granted that, for example, Ian is a motivating force. There's no question about that from the very beginning. His enthusiasm, his commitment, his persistence, I think you all know aware of that, his persistence ensures that this group, this organization lives on. And it's extremely important that it does. And without him, there was a risk that it might just get lost in all the trials and tribulations that we're facing. And it is because of those trials and tribulations that the objectives of the CLG and the need for critical or critically thinking lawyers is even greater than it was when we all started. Now, why is it greater? And I just want to not be negative, but to be positive. It's very easy to be the purveyor of doom and gloom. I don't want to do that. There are plenty of people who do that on a daily basis. That's not why we are lawyers. We're not there to perpetrate more doom and gloom. We're there to, as it were, raise hopes, raise visions, and in fact, obviously, promote ideals. We do other things as well, but that's the core business, it seems to me, that should infuse every other bit of work we do. Excuse me, the reason I say there's the bigger need, it can be simplified into a few propositions or statements, just so we get the doom and the gloom out of the way first, but to see what the obstacle is, what the threat is that we're all facing. And I suspect every single one of you who are there today will recognize what I'm talking about. And it's not limited to the United Kingdom. In the past, I think we've perhaps been too parochial, too local. Actually, what we are seeing in the United Kingdom, what we're perceiving in the United Kingdom is universal. Throughout the citizens of the world, there is a massive threat. And the threat comes in two forms. There is the threat to life, the right to life, which is coming from those who perpetrate systemic violence, unjustified violence. Now that can come from the state itself, the employment of state agents to perpetrate violence on individuals or groups of individuals. And we all know the states that engage in this unjustified violence, which in turn breeds more violence from others, other groups who are ideologically driven, but I would call it, on the whole, bigotry, from groups who believe they can exterminate others. And I don't support that either. That's something else that we're facing. They don't believe in the equality of rights any more than the states. And it isn't only in the form of violence and death that we're faced at the moment. There's another kind of death. A death that comes through the environment, through economic deprivation, through poverty. And the poverty in the world, which often comes alongside the violence, is the way in which the environment in which we live, which is often forgotten about, the environment in which we live, the seas, the forests, even the deserts, are being again, annihilated, often by the same people, the same groups who are perpetrating the physical violence. And right at the core of all of this are basic, fundamental human rights, which I think is what we're all combining together to promote. They're simply stated, but very often they are marginalized, they are used by people who do not believe in them for one moment. Now that threat to human rights, which comes through the environment, through poverty, through violence, that threat has to be resisted by us taking a stand for the principles that lie at the heart of the United Nations Charter, that lie at the heart of the European Convention. Now, you will recognize that the threat posed by the institutions and the groupings that I've already referred to or alluded to is often repression. Not just in the form of physical violence, not just in the case of poverty, but actual legislation which deprives. Within the United Kingdom, I think possibly some of the issues you'll be debating is the way within the United Kingdom, never mind elsewhere for a moment, there has been a reduction, severe reduction, a severe recession, actually going under the name of austerity, in the way in which welfare rights are attacked, trade union rights are being attacked, the right to take judicial review is being attacked, the right to legal aid is being attacked, the National Health Service is being attacked, all of it being cut. Being cut by those who we now have discovered over the last week or so in the Panama Papers, which won't surprise any of us who've been in the maelstrom of political life for the last 30 to 40 years, and that includes me, is that those who exercise the kind of violence and power I've been talking about make sure that they, of all people, stash away their economic power. Sometimes, obviously, to avoid tax, to evade tax, but sometimes to amass an empire of their own. There are two worlds. There are two classes still. And it's polarizing in a way that's even bigger than it polarized before. And we have to be aware of that gap, and we have to ensure that it is exposed for what it is. And the Panama Papers and the leak of the Panama Papers did just that, in the same way as the exposure of the expenses scandal, which is now almost in the mists of time. The money that was being, as it were, stashed away in relation to moats, Mars bars, you name it, they were claiming and then wanting none of us to discover. So it's a theme that is going right the way through. And it's just when they didn't want that disclosed, but the newspapers managed in the end to show just how devious it was and how devious offshore accounts are. And the United Kingdom, through its ex-colonial situation, is in fact at the heart of tax avoidance and evasion. It is known to facilitate this. Well, now, of course, having had the Prime Minister take a week to finally, as it were, come clean as to exactly what his assets were, why he couldn't say that in the beginning if it's all so straightforward. But there are other revelations and disclosures that have been made over the last 2 to 3 years which connect to another side of the repressive state that comes into being internally and externally, and that's the surveillance state. That is the state in which we live and are watched and monitored every moment of the day. And of course it comes through the social networking sites, Google and all the rest of it. And no doubt there is a battle to ensure that governments aren't able to open mobile phones, but now they found a way to do it. Because of course what Snowden was really doing in our name was to ensure that we recognized that when there were denials about their ability to trawl social networks and to, as it were, audit trail exactly what we're doing. Not actually necessarily the content, although they can do that as well, but where the mobile phone is, who it's ringing, where the emails are going, which sites are visited. And almost en bloc, that's what he was saying. And he's the one who is being, as it were, targeted as a traitor. The traitors are those who, in our name, claim we have a democratic situation, but actually at the end of the day, accountability is the one thing that our democracy has not given us yet. And why they're screaming about Jeremy Corbyn is, of course, he has got a power base, and of course they recognised that the power base that he's got actually links to a lot of ordinary people who feel they've been excluded. It may not be wide enough yet, but one has to tread carefully in this situation. Now, I raise all of these political issues because at the end of the day, we have a responsibility to ensure that those who are interested in a buttress against a state which is becoming out of control and centralised. I mean, we've even got Igor Judge on this very day I'm recording it this morning, talking about how the sovereignty of Parliament being undermined by secondary legislation and statutory instruments. Well, that's where we as lawyers should be monitoring just how many instruments are going through on the nod and actually changing laws without proper scrutiny. So we have a big task. Now you will be saying, well, how do we go about this task? Well, it seems to me now we have to consider ways in which we can regroup. And in fact, of course, the electronic media at the same time gives us that opportunity, aware as we must be about security issues allied to what we do. But we are very conscious, we are all very conscious, that actually protest, which this government and the previous government, at the end of the day, peaceful process? I don't think so. That's not what they're in. Look what they did to the students. You all know the cases that arose in relation to that. Alfie Meadows. I mentioned one name. It will conjure up the memories of what effectively riot police did on these demonstrations. So we have a responsibility to ensure that the rule of law and the democratic, as it were, right is preserved, just like we hope that the Pitchford inquiry will be looking at how the rule of law was undermined by a state within a state, the SDS demonstration unit. My goodness, what was that about? That was about targeting those organizations seen by the state to be a threat. Not criminal organizations, but political organizations. And it's insidious. That is why, no doubt, the United Kingdom over many generations has been known as perfidious Albion. But we have to regroup electronically. So Ian's idea of having an electronic conference was a good one, but at the end of the day, interface, meeting together in one place, is the form of solidarity that actually moves it on. That is why public demonstrations, public protests are important. Now, many lawyers will be saying, well, all this is very fine talk, but actually, how do we do this when the resources, the legal aid and all the rest of it has disappeared? Well, we have to be thinking of new ways of ensuring our existence and our persistence, as is Ian. And there are ways. And I think the lawyers, and that is why lawyers are becoming themselves targets. You may or may not be aware that every year there's the Day of the Endangered Lawyer. This year it was January the 24th. And the demonstrations that take place worldwide is to emphasize the fact that country after country after country, when it finally discovers that there is a threat to its power base, in the sense that somebody's questioning the autocracy, the oligarchy, or whatever it happens to be, they go for the journalists, they go for the poets, and they go for the lawyers. Now this year it was Honduras, demonstrations across the world, because there are more lawyers murdered in Honduras, murdered in Honduras than in any other country in the world. But they're not alone. A few years ago, I stood outside the Spanish embassy because those representing the elements of the Basques in Spain, they were being locked up. And as the camera pans across the world, it happens in Egypt. They lock up lawyers. It happens in Turkey. They lock up lawyers. It happens in the Far East, the Philippines. They lock up lawyers. That is why we have to mark it each year for the Day of the Endangered Lawyer. And don't think that the United Kingdom is in any way excluded from this, because this year, it's happened before, lawyers have been targeted. Two firms, effectively, of solicitors who do public work, defending people affected by the wars that we conduct in the public name, namely in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the kind of vilification from David Cameron and from other politicians is quite unacceptable. And of course, this happened during all those years in which there was, as it was called, the Irish Troubles, but that's actually a euphemism, but all those years of Irish resistance. Lawyers came in for criticism then, as well as a lot of other people. And as you may know, in the end, 2 lawyers were murdered. We have to remember, this was part of the United Kingdom. Rosemary Nelson and Pat Finucane. We should never forget that they were just civil rights lawyers and they were murdered in the United Kingdom. So we're not immune. I'm not saying this so that you are frightened to act. I'm saying the opposite, that solidarity with those under attack, whether they're citizens in the workplace or whether they're those defending the citizens, they also need to have protection. I'll give you an example. I'll come to how some of these things are funded. The peace brigades, who began their lives as an organization in Canada, and they set out with a very singular objective. Theirs was to ensure that where lawyers were practically on the front line and under attack, initially they were looking at South America, where lawyers and others, non-lawyers, were defending trade unionists, workers trying to protect Amazonian forests against companies desecrating the environment. And of course there were murderous threats against those lawyers. And what the peace brigades began to do was to say to people, would you be a companion? You don't have to be a lawyer to do it, but it helps if you are a lawyer. To, as it were, pair up with those people on the front line. And that's what a lot of people did. They volunteered, and obviously the organization was able to help with a certain amount of finances and expenses to get them to the countries. So this was a very practical way in which you begin the process of protecting human lives and human rights. Now there's other issues that as active lawyers, so critical lawyers is not just about thinking about the critique of the law, but acting, actually becoming, as it were, men and women of action. People like to see that you're doing something, not just talking about it. We don't want talking shops, but there's enough of that. There's enough people who have got their brains together to think about what the problem is. We need to be considering how we put into practice what we preach. I give another example. Peace Brigade's an international one. There are a number of threats to the environment. One of them, again, is in the United Kingdom, but it's not only the monopoly of the United Kingdom. That's fracking. And I'm not going to spend time explaining fracking because I'm sure all of you know what it is. It's the exploitation of natural resources and putting the environment and people's lives at risk. It's happening in North America, but this government, like the previous one, is terribly anxious that the shale gas resources that the United Kingdom have can be exploited by oil companies, and they're, as it were, bending the planning laws and in facilitating with all sorts of economic carrots, as it were, companies to move in, and effectively, as it happened in Blackpool, with minor earth tremors when they're merely exploring for the wells they want to sink. Now, communities rose up against this and actually got the council to not grant permission, which annoyed the government no end. But they were aided in Sussex and in Lancashire by lawyers coming together and saying, we want to help you, advising you about your rights as citizens to demonstrate, your rights as citizens to object to the planning applications, to find what is wrong with the planning applications, what safety reports have not been properly completed or registered. Now, these are all very practical things. You say, well, how's that going to be paid for? Well, it is being paid for in certain circumstances. But of course, it needs you out there to help, as it were, indicate how the money to pay for the defence of the realm, which I call the environment, is done. And it's now becoming very popular. Even companies are considering how they, for their commercial purposes, might. And it's crowdfunding. Because if you have a community of several thousand people, all contributing equally a small amount of money, it mounts up very quickly. And that is exactly what happened in Sussex. But the battle can't, you win it, the first one. You don't win the war. That's the first stage. You have to be ready to come back into action. So you need units of people who are familiar with environmental law, are prepared to travel, are prepared to help raise money. It's no use waiting, as it were, for some sort of public funding, because you're not going to get it in that way. It's got to be, as it were, organic, homegrown, and inspired by lawyers who are committed and mean what they say. So I've only given that one example. There are many other examples of the way in which, if you're prepared to be outside the university, outside the set of chambers, outside the firm of solicitors, but outside on the ground, and seen to be on the ground and standing together with people at the same time as campaigning and petitioning and all the other things that one's done over the many, many years. And so once you begin to gather all this material together, you see that the need for each one of you is even greater than it was 25, 30 years ago. Because now the battle lines are diffuse, they're international, and there's a power block of wealth and power and corruption on one side, and ordinary people on the other who are struggling. Most people in the United Kingdom at the moment don't believe the green shoots of recovery are growing under their feet. Most people are struggling from day to day, and their rights to make challenges are being, as it were, eroded from day to day, which means that many lawyers also are affected by the cuts, because 40% cuts in relation to the protections that can be implemented in the courts and access to the courts to ensure that people are not eradicated altogether. One other example I just want to give, just to show that the power of communities. I've been involved now in 3 or 4 citizens' tribunals. This is where a community feels that justice has not been done to a particular issue or cause. The first one I did was Russell, in relation to the Palestinians and the constant daily threat, physical threat, coming from Israel, as well as lots of other threats. It's a problem you're familiar with. And we set up, it wasn't just me, a lot of other people, set up a Russell tribunal in the tradition of Russell tribunals, because the community said, the United Nations, for example, isn't actually helping us at the end of the day because of this Security Council veto system. It's just ridiculous. US always vetoes anything that could be possibly construed as hostile to Israel. And of course the United Kingdom, as usual, just abstains. So we set up the tribunal in order to demonstrate with evidence how basic human rights and humanitarian international legislation is being breached every single day. Identify the breaches and specify to the United Nations, this is a job you should be doing, and you should be ensuring as part of a general obligation we have. And if you need to see what the general obligation is, read the judgment in the Wall from the International Court of Justice, a case that was sent there by the United Nations. Now, what the Russell Tribunal did was, we've had 5 sessions, it's come out with 5 reports. Do read them if you've ever got a chance. But that required a lot of input from ordinary lawyers from around the world willing to put this together in order, in a sense, to highlight to the world how bad it is and to highlight to the United Nations. And in the end, we were permitted an audience at the United Nations in order to present our conclusions and in order to, as it were, hopefully provoke them into some kind of action. And interesting, I'm not saying it was because of what we did, but I think we played a small part. It was after that that status was accredited to the Palestinians, a status that the US absolutely did not want to occur. Now, of course, things move very slowly, but this is the kind of thing. There are lots of other tribunals that communities are recognizing actually means something. I just cite it. There was a one in the United Kingdom. I had something to do with 2 to 3 years ago to do with the national health. I've done 2 of them now. One of them was for the Lewisham community, who felt that Jeremy Hunt was and is decimating national health resources in the interests of private finance, no doubt, and privatization. And again, that tribunal meant a great deal to the community, but it was only helped in the end to get it off the ground by a number of us volunteering to do it pro bono in order to get that level of awareness and to allow people a voice when they felt they didn't have a voice. So the message here is, to all of you, is that there's an incredible opportunity here. It's not easy, but it's not only a challenge, but it's very satisfying when you finally combine with ordinary people and you feel a movement. And I think that the social media, the various, 38 degrees, Avaz and so on, these have provided an amazing basis from which thousands of people contribute and they make a difference. And I really want to end by suggesting that the conference actually has at its end some sort of concrete proposal to either support an area of the world or even an area of the United Kingdom which is under threat by having a unit, a critical lawyers unit, prepared to swing into action in relation to the issue as it's seen. It might be refugees. It might be the camp in northern France. Who knows where it's going to come from next, but ready to go into action. That's one proposition. Another one is, besides creating a critical lawyers unit, is actually a critical lawyers, if you like, social networking site, which, rather like Momentum has done for the Labour Party. Now, some agree with it, some don't, but actually it's been pervasive, and it's regular, and it's efficient for at least gathering together opinions on issues that we can't always get together to do. And that was one of Ian's difficulties about this conference, is finding a date and trying to get everybody together. Well, we don't have to wait necessarily to foregather in the one place. We can do it on a socially networking site, and in fact you can, as it were, engineer hubs in which only the people who are contributing know what is being said if you want security. So there are ways of doing everything. And I just feel at this moment, for a lot of people that certainly I speak to within the legal profession outside, there's a feeling of hopelessness, of disempowerment, which actually, once we as lawyers begin feeling that, then the chips are down. And it seems to me we should be rising above that and giving hope, because there is hope while there's life, giving hope to others and inspiring others into some form of action. Now, I've taken rather longer than I would do if I'd been there in person, and I've no doubt this can be edited down if you want. However, I feel strongly that there's a body of people out there who've had enough and who have the wherewithal, intellectually and in their terms of being able-bodied, to make a difference. Every single person can make a difference if we have what is in the old terms a form of solidarity. Because if they pick off one of us, there's someone else standing alongside. The moment they can pick you off individually, you're finished. So we have to stand together, and we have to be seen to be standing together, and not be afraid, as it were, to put forward the values that we've stood for ever since CLG started. So good luck and good fortune. Thanks.